So we are going to talk about data now. We're going to talk about a program which has been running for the last 6 years, and has been tracking the effects of the conscious and unconscious school environment on the minds of the children involved in the program. I imagine that you, after this morning's session so far, have had all sorts of questions, new educational questions, pop into your head as you've begun to think about the mind not as an autonomous, impermeable, individual thinking system, but as a collective, plural, group, ecologically connected entity. And I imagine you've been asking yourself the question, if you were involved in school management or school leadership, how does my school, or let's use a metaphor here, let's imagine your children are driving along their educational curriculum, progressing towards their academic goals, and school is a kind of road. How does this road, with all of its messages, its signposts, its bends, its turns, its undulations, the behaviour of the other pupils, the litter that's thrown out of the window, all of those conscious and unconscious effects of that road, how is that affecting my children's learning? How is it affecting the ability of my children to become those healthy, rounded adults? Every single head teacher in this room would say of their school that our school produces well-rounded, healthy, curious, resourceful individuals. And I'm absolutely sure that that, of course, is the case. Can you show me any evidence to that effect? And that's a much harder thing to demonstrate. Because what is it we're actually measuring that would quantify that? And then there's this second question. If we're now aware, and it's a question that was really kind of raised a moment ago, if we're now aware that the mind is permeable and ecological, then the responsibility for us to stick with this metaphor of signposting our road suddenly becomes very significant, because we can't leave that to chance. We have to become active road designers and think very carefully about every message and every agent who's contributing to that. So how can I signpost my school road in a healthy way, but not just so that my children don't crash, to use an analogy, but so that I can teach them to steer? Because buried in the questions again we've had is that the real quality, the real cognitive skill we need to be equipping our children with is a metacognitive skill. It's the ability to see themselves as a learner in a system that is having an influence on them and become aware of that system, and then aware of how it's affecting them, and then aware of the choices that they can make in response to that. That's metacognition. So how can we make that process explicit? So the program I'm going to talk about is a program run by my organisation, STEER. It's called the Aaas tracking program. Aaas stands for Affective Social Tracking. And every year we report on the findings from the past year, and that's what I'm going to be doing now over the next 25 minutes. I'm telling you the data that we've collected through this program over the last year, and we're measuring a function of the brain which we use to steer. Now, this afternoon after lunch, I'm going to explain to you the cognitive process that we actually use, the technique and the technology that we use to do that. But for now, I'm just going to ask you to take that for read, that on this analogy of children driving the road of adolescence, of school, that they are being influenced by their environment, that they are making choices consciously and unconsciously to change direction, that are influencing them. Let's call that steering. That we're measuring the choices they're making consciously and unconsciously to steer. We're measuring the biases, actually. And we're also measuring the effect of the road on their pre-existing steering. So the program measures both how children steer off the school road and then on the school road. So we can quantify the difference. We can say that the changes in how this group of children are steering can be attributed to the school environment. because we can compare the two, how they steer off the school road and how they then steer on the school road. So it's quite a large program of pupils. Remember, we're measuring the plural mind, but that's made up of lots of individuals in cohorts of user groups, schools. And we have now 30,000 children who are involved in that program. And that's growing every year. So next year it will be the double again, it'll be about 60,000 children who are involved in this program. And the advantage of this program is that it's a longitudinal study, so the same children are being tracked year after year. And so we're getting not just a cohort analysis, we're getting a chronological developmental analysis of how these cohorts are changing over time as well. And I should say that the schools involved in this program are involved not because they're principally signing up for a research program, but because they want this data. They have made a choice to say this data can give us helpful feedback in order to guide the choices, the way we design our school road, both for the groups of children in our school, but also for individual children as well. So they're buying it for that benefit, and they're buying it in the context of a problem with UK education. It's not just a problem with UK education, but it's a problem around mental health and declines in adolescent mental health, or to put it another way, increases in risks in young people developing patterns of social and mental health and relating, which put them at higher risk. And they are using this data to help them identify pupils who are developing patterns of thinking which increase their social and mental health risks. Now, I introduced these concepts earlier on, this language of polar bias, overregulation and dysregulation. Let me just remind you what they mean. Polar bias children who are developing patterns of steering which are iterated and fixed, which they don't then adjust as they move from context to context. Overregulation, that very conscious awareness of the environment. These are children who are thinking all the time about how am I being monitored? How am I being monitored by my peers? How am I being monitored on social media? And how should I react to that? So they're deploying a lot of conscious energy in monitoring those unconscious priming influences. That's what we call overregulation. And then dysregulation is children who are being dysregulated, who are adopting biases as a result of the context that they're in. Something is consciously or unconsciously triggering them and causing them to become and then intentionally blind or biased in the way that they're then reacting to that environment. We're measuring, again, this comparative data between how children on the left, what we call their generalized pattern of steering, how they steer off the school road, and then on the right, how they're then steering on the school road. So we can attribute what's on the right to the school. We measure it on a bipolar scale. We're measuring this degree of bias, and we actually measure 4 aspects of it. The first is called self-disclosure, then seeking change, then trust of self, and then trust of others. So we're measuring how children are steering these 4 components of what's called their self-regulation, their affective social self-regulation. And what I'm going to do is to show you some of our data from the last 12 months. And just bear in mind that this is a large cohort study. It's one of the largest studies that is ongoing in the UK, tracking adolescent social emotional development. And remember, it's across a large population of more than 100 schools from the age of 8 to 18, day and boarding, state and independent, boy and girl. So it's a rich and a strong, robust cohort. So here's a graph up on the screen, and you've got a column there that says school. Now that column there is showing the degree of what we call polar bias in the cohort of children across this school. Now this is actually maintained school data. So we have some data from the independent sector, we have some data from the maintained sector. This is exclusively from the maintained sector because we're interested in the particular effects of these 2 categories here, LAC and EAL. I'll explain what they mean in a moment. Now, above the line there in red, that's the proportion of the pupils in the school who come into school with what we call polar biases, dysregulated biases. So that's their state coming into school. Below the line, in grey, is what happens to that proportion of biases on the school road, when they're driving on the school road. So you can see in this data here that the number of polar biases goes up on the school road. The grey is bigger than the red by some proportion of about a third. So the school here is actually having something of a dysregulating effect. But I don't want to focus so much on that. I want to compare it to two other categories within the school, because we're very interested politically at the moment about provision and resourcing provision. All be very aware of the educational funding cuts, the pressure, stroke crisis, where resources should be allocated. And the question, therefore, needs to be driven by what's going to have the most effect on the children who need it most. And one group of children who need provision are those from looked after backgrounds. And that's what LAC stands for, looked after children. So let's have a look at the same children, the same data that we're looking at, but children who are coming from a looked after context. Now look at that for a moment and just interpret that for yourself, the significance of that second column. So perhaps unsurprisingly, looked after children have more out-of-school biases. They have more generalised biases because they're coming from environments that are, this is a reflection of the less secure environments that they're coming from. And what's really encouraging is that the provision that the school is making is having a really positive impact in reducing the number of polar biases. So polar biases are correlated with higher social and mental health risks, and school is like a road that is helping these children to feel safer and more secure, to drive and navigate the road of adolescence more securely. It's a really positive outcome. Here's the data for children with English as an additional language, EAL. And you'll see that the data is almost the mirror image. That children, EAL children are out of school, have lower biases, much lower than the mean across the whole school, the red on the left-hand side, but coming into the school environment are being dysregulated by the school. So they're driving onto the school road, and the school is actually increasing the risk of those children crashing. Now, there are some fairly obvious kind of possible causes to that. It doesn't take a brain scientist to understand why school is likely to be a difficult environment if it's not your first language. But my point is not to make a value judgment over this, but to make the point that if we want to allocate resources, we need data that is actually telling us the effect of where we're spending resources at the moment, because the government has pots of money that it allocates to each of these two categories, and we could put other categories on here as well. SEND, pupil premium, gifted and talented. What effect is that spending, or that withdrawal of spending, having on pupils? Well, we could wait for the outcomes, the socioeconomic outcomes. We could wait for the exclusion outcomes. We could wait for the demographic outcomes. But that's very late data. Wouldn't it be better to have early data on what's actually happening in the minds of the children on account of the environment that they are being given? And that's what excites me about this data, is a quality and precision and insight and immediacy of being able to understand those effects. So just to tie this with our model of the mind again, the plural mind, what we are able to do is get a real picture of the priming effect, the conscious and unconscious effects of that contextual environment on the minds of those children. That's what those previous charts were telling us. Let's have a look at another chart. Okay, so this is a developmental chart from year 3 to year 13 of boys and girls, blue and brown. Boys are blue, girls are brown. measuring a component of steering. It was the first component I measured in that list of 4, called self-disclosure. Self-disclosure. Now, self-disclosure is the willingness we have to share ideas, thoughts and opinions with other people around us. And it's been correlated with lower mental health risks. So if you are more willing, by and large, to share with other people, to listen to other people, collaborate with other people, you're less likely to be isolated, you're less likely to develop hidden patterns of behaviour which other people are unaware of and unable to help support you with. And you're more likely to be able to reach out for help. So moderately high self-disclosure is a protective factor during adolescence. Now, the first thing you notice during this is that there's a gender difference in the development of self-disclosure as boys and girls grow up, and it's fairly consistent. And it might surprise some of you, because I bet there are some people in the room who assume that girls who are more generally emotionally literate than boys and say more words than boys in the course of a day are more disclosing than boys. But actually the data doesn't support that. There is a consistent and strong finding that girls actually hide and conceal their real thoughts, ideas, feelings and opinions. They hide rather than share with others. So what they're saying isn't necessarily revealing what's going on. In fact, they may be very good at deflecting attention from what's going on. And that is perhaps one of the reasons why one of the highest risk groups in the country at the moment is girls from high-performing aspirant homes who are very fluent and verbally able to present a version of themselves that deflects from a set of behaviours or concerns which they are hiding away. Now, this is the data of how self-disclosure develops out of school, that generalised pattern. And what I'm going to show you next is the same chart for the same cohort, but when this cohort, 30,000 children across the country, are steering on the school road. So just take a look at the difference. So that's in school. Let me just toggle that again. So that's out of school, and that's in school. Out of school, in school. Out of school, in school. What do you notice happens to both? Decreases. So school across the country is lowering the willingness of children to share. But what's happening to girls more than boys? Especially at a particular cluster of year groups. There's a dip, isn't there? A cluster of year groups between year 9 and 10, there is a significant dip where boys are actually improving their self-disclosure at that point. So in early adolescence, around 13, 14, boys are actually becoming more disclosing, whereas girls are actually becoming less disclosing than boys. Less able or willing to reach out for help. Now, head teachers among you will, I suspect, resonate with the view that year 10 is often a difficult year, and it's often a very difficult year for girls. And here is data that is perhaps explaining why year 10 is often a difficult year for girls, because there is a genuine difference. There is an experience of themselves in which they find it very difficult to reach out for help and to receive that from the environment around them. I think I've got time very briefly to mention a study I did with a small group of schools, and delighted to say some of the staff from the schools are here, in which we looked, this is just an aside, we looked at the effect of school notices on self-disclosure. And I was interested in whether, when I was at school, when you took part in a competition or when you got your end of term grades, they were published on a list that ranked you from top to bottom. Everything was published on the list. How many people went to schools where everything or something was published? And there you were, somewhere in the list, up or down. Okay. So we were interested in the priming effect on self-disclosure for that kind of announcing of success and failure, that sort of public ranking. And what we found when we measured this was that and this was tested with year 5 children, so sort of 9, 10-year-olds, with this cohort of year 5 children across 2 schools, consistent finding that when children, the effect that publishing these ranked results had was different for different kinds of children. If children had what we call a low trust of themselves, then to see themselves ranked highly gave them an impulse to become very highly disclosing. So what did they want to do when they saw themselves coming top? They wanted to tell everyone about it. So you know children like that? Yeah? They want to tell everyone about it. What happened when that same child saw themselves coming at the bottom? What do you think happened? Yeah, you would have hypothesized, wouldn't you, that they wanted to hide it. Do you know what they actually wanted to do? They wanted to tell everyone about it. Now that's surprising, isn't it? They wanted to tell everyone about it. And the interpretation of that is that what they feared most was insignificance, lack of attention. And so any kind of story that they could tell was better than no story, than being invisible. Because if you have a low trust of yourself, you feel that you are invisible. And so give me something to tell other people so that I become part of the group. That was a piece of data that reinforces the fact that our minds are plural, that we're ecological, and that principally children's behaviour is social, and what they're doing is trying to fit in. Now, one more question. You can redeem yourselves if you get this one right. Children who started with a high trust of themselves, so they intrinsically thought that they were good at things, that they valued themselves, that they were successful. Children who had a high trust of themselves, what do you think the effect of seeing themselves at the top of the chart was, top of the ranking, on their self-disclosure? Mixed views. I suspect if I hadn't set this up, you would have said higher, because they're going to want to be telling everyone about it, to reassert their dominance in the group. And in fact, it was the opposite. They wanted to become lower self-disclosing. Why? Because they didn't want to be excluded from the group and experience the kind of tall poppy syndrome where you stand out from others. Rather slow down and cross the line together than be out in front, and then risk being isolated from your peers. So self-disclosure, social mental health factors correlated with it. It's going on all the time in our schools, and all of our messages, all of our announcements, all of our posters, all of our listings, all of our policies are having an effect on this all of the time. Now, I talked about over-regulating. Remember that pattern of being very conscious of what's going on around you? These are the children who are very conscious of these unconscious behaviours that most people miss, but they're paying attention to them. The funny thing about your over-regulators is that at least some of them are your top performers in school. They're top performers because they don't miss anything, because they're very conscientious, because they notice everything that's going on. They're always prepared, they're always looking ahead. They're like a driver looking ahead down the road, noticing everything all the time. Okay, there we are. There's the driver, noticing all the cues all the time. So the question is, are over-regulators your successful top performers that you should be celebrating, or are they unsustainably driving a road that actually increases some risks to them? Here's our data. This is a chart showing the proportion of over-regulation in UK schools from year 3 up to year 13. And you'll see that the trend is upwards. So the proportion of over-regulators goes up as children go from 8 to 18 in school. But I want to highlight those 3 points in the chart, in the sequence. And you'll see these are 3 points where there is a significant step up. Now, year 3 to 4 is interesting because these are mainly, this data is mainly taken from schools where children are going from some kind of pre-prep to a prep, And that's the point at which they make that transition. So there's a significant social shift, and these children are becoming more over-regulating as they cope with that social alarm or social challenge of managing that situation. The next, again, this is mainly independent school data, happens in year 7 to 8. What happens in independent schools in year 8? Common entrance, so the major threshold to get into your next school or not. Very significant shift up in over-regulating as children anticipate that. And then 11, 12, 13, the public exam years, that's interesting, isn't it? So there's a climb up to that, and then there's that little dip in year 12. Interesting, isn't it? So year 11, year 13, pressure of exams, year 12. Now, if I tell you that there is statistically a higher risk that children who over-regulate go on to do this, you might look at that data in another way. So what we're doing is building points into our system which increase the risk of that. Because over-regulation is cognitively very effortful and it's depleting. And it's hard for children to socially and self-monitor all the time. And there is a risk that they will just give up, they can't do it, and it's associated with concerns such as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, other aspects of self-harm when they dysregulate. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing some exam points, some particular points in the narrative of school life that our children are going through as they travel, if you like, from left to right. And that there are particular points that are priming our young people in a particular way. I need to move on a little bit faster. We did a study involving cohorts of independent and maintained schools, day and boarding schools, and we were interested in the phenomenon in this country that despite the fact that maintained schools have improved their academic outcomes very significantly over the last 15 years or so, and the very high-performing schools, the gap in terms of occupying top-level positions in society hasn't narrowed at all. So there's a social mobility gap that is not explained by the improvements in academic outcomes. So there are other factors there. Now, of course, there may be factors of wealth, of cultural capital, all sorts of things, but we were interested in whether there was any differences in the priming effects of different sorts of school that might be explanatory in the kind of child that came out at the end, whether it was actually baking into the child some properties, some skills, some characteristics, some qualities which were not academic, but which were explaining success beyond the school environment. And our supposition, I suppose, was that, well, there's likely to be a difference between fee and non-fee paying schools. Now, we didn't find that. There was no difference between fee and non-fee paying schools, but what there was a difference between was day and boarding schools. And on the chart here on the left-hand side, you've got the day school mean, again for self-disclosure, and on the right-hand side, the boarding school mean for self-disclosure. So on the darker column there is the self-disclosure those children have outside school, and then the lighter column is how they adjust that in school. And what you'll see there is that across our day schools, self-disclosure drops. Only a bit, but it drops. Whereas across boarding schools, it goes up. Only a bit, but it does. And it was consistent across all year groups. And we found it also correlated with another component that we measured, trust of others. Same pattern. Now, those two patterns together, we can paint a little psychological picture here. So if you are more self-disclosing, if you have a higher trust of other people, you tend to be better at forming social relationships. You tend to be more group-orientated. You tend to be more willing to adjust and adapt to other people around you. Whereas if you have lower self-disclosure, lower trust of others, you're more autonomous. You tend to have a more self-contained social posture. You're less influenced by other people around you, less group-orientated. We found that in boys, and we also found the same pattern in girls. And what we found, actually, was that this difference was attributable to the experience of being in a boarding house. And the boarding house, if you've ever been in one, is quite a confined environment of 60 or 70 kids who've got to muck along with each other for 5 years. They've got to compromise, they've got to work out how to concede and not fall out with people. And what we found was that these psychological patterns were quite durable. So we were able to show that the experience of boarding and the boarding house environment had a differential effect than the day school environment. 2 different effects, but that was actually quite a durable effect. It wasn't a brief transitory effect. It was actually transferred to the way those peoples then related in a whole much wider range of social environments that we tested. So it seemed to be becoming a kind of transferable property. And this was evidence that cognitive, affective, social context can have a direct outcome in the characteristics of the young people who are formed by it. Now, I'm making no value judgment here about whether there is something better in being more autonomous and contained or being more socially orientated. But you might like to think about that as you go away, as to whether you think that might be a component of the different social outcomes that these 2 populations experience beyond school. Finally, if you're a head teacher and you want to ignore the messages of today, then you might be hoping that there's no evidence that school priming context has any bearing on academic outcomes. That you can close your ears to this and say, as long as we carry on teaching as we do, we will get the same outcomes. And I'm sorry to have to disappoint you on this. Here is a chart of the schools who took part in a research study, a proportion of all of our schools, and it's academically ranked, the highest rank, 19th, the lowest ranked, on A-level grades, okay? So A-level performance in those schools. And what we're measuring here in this chart is what we might call the width of the school road. So in my analogy, children steering on the school road. You can imagine that if you're a head teacher driving the school road, if you really control the messages, if you really kind of narrow down the school experience, if you really kind of keep people on the straight and narrow, and there's little freedom for them to divert or make other choices, then that's a kind of narrowing the school road. And what this chart is a measurement of is the width of the school road. So these schools here on the right-hand side have a wider school road than the schools on the left-hand side. The highest ranking schools in the country are associated with having the narrowest of school roads. Now, I should say that this was specifically around social and emotional steering. It was not around what I would call cognitive steering or steering in the classroom, about how they actually were learning in different ways in different subjects, where we actually found the reverse. But that's for another time. But in terms of social and emotional control, without a doubt, if you're a head teacher, listen up, you are likely to get better academic results by controlling and narrowing your school road such that there is a narrower repertoire of social and emotional possibilities and behaviours than if you widen it. That's what that data is telling us. I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to gloss over that. I want to hand over now to Richard Backhouse, who is the principal of a group of schools. And rather than me talking just about data, he's going to talk just for a few minutes about real school practice, and how he's been using data like this to actually help his teachers shape the policies of the school.
Thank you, Simon. So I come to the podium with Robert Plomin's words ringing in my mind that the plural of anecdote is not data. You've had the data. I'm going to give you, I'm afraid, anecdote, which is less, I think, clear, but which I hope is extremely helpful to you. We've been using Aaas tracking data at Berkhamsted for a little while, and I want to talk to you about how we use it and what it means. I should say in doing that I am not the local expert in it. I have colleagues who are much more expert than I am. You'll be glad to know that they are more the authors of these slides than I am. But first I want to briefly address why we are doing this. I think teachers and by extension school leaders come in two essential types. And I'm mindful as I say that there are of course two kinds of people in the world. Those who extrapolate from incomplete data and those who don't. There are two kinds of teacher and head teacher in the world. There are those who think that all their pupils should turn out exactly like them, and there are those who think that their pupils should turn out exactly like themselves. I take the view, and I would have thought all the school leaders in this room take the view that their own incarnation is a sufficient manifestation of their own kind of person in the world. I think the world has enough of me with one, arguably too many. And therefore trying to turn a large cohort of young people into people just like me would be a great disservice to the county, let alone the world. And therefore our role is somehow to help young people genuinely to grow into themselves. So my vision, I think most educators' vision, is to enable people to grow up somehow independent of influence. Slightly depressing idea in the context of what John was saying to us earlier about the effect of priming on us, but to try and help these people to grow into three-dimensional technicolor versions of themselves. I also think parents want us to do that. I don't think I meet very many parents who come to me saying, what size is your and shape is your jelly mould? We want to know how you will stuff our child into it so that they'll turn out exactly like every other child in your school. And possibly most importantly of all, I don't think many young people, particularly as they cross that hormonal frontier into adolescence, would be particularly attracted to a school which promised to turn them out as carbon copies of the children to the left and the right of them. Although a friend of mine did observe recently that his child went into the sixth form and could wear their own clothes to school, they declared their individuality by ruthlessly wearing exactly the same clothes as all their peers. However, all that said, the key thing we should be asking ourselves, I think, as school leaders, is how are we shoving children into jelly moulds? To what extent are we doing that? And how is the jelly mould that we are carefully putting children into, how constructive is that for their development? Where are their biases in it? Where is our model actually unhelpful for children? Because it will be in some respect or other. Allowing them to grow into independent versions of themselves, if you like, around a school ethos. So there are three particular areas that I want to mention in that respect, that we look at our pupils and we say, how is what we're doing helping them? And the first is in terms of self-disclosure. We notice that our pupils have a lower social self-disclosure score than the average or than what we would like them to. And so we have a number of things that we are doing intentionally to increase the self-disclosure scores of our students. And that's on a whole population level, as well as at an individual child level, where individual action plans based on their Aaas tracking data can help those with particularly low self-disclosure scores to get better, but without giving necessarily a broadcast message, you should all be more self-disclosing. Hugely unhelpful for those who already have a polar bias towards too much self-disclosure. So a number of initiatives here which we are running, which we are intending to measure increases in self-disclosure score over time in our school as a result of observing that at the moment the environment of the school is constraining, or appears to be constraining, our pupils' ability to disclose what they are really like. If you like, mask wearing. And I personally think that's a particularly effortful activity for a teenager. And it reduces their ability to sit in a chemistry or maths or English literature lesson and just enjoy and soak up those subjects. Actually, being a diamond school, I often say to parents that in years 7 to 11, the chemistry that our children are thinking about in a chemistry lesson has nothing to do with how long they can hold the glance or the attention of the pupil on the other side of the room. It's all going on in test tubes. It's that kind of concentration of focus that we're hoping that our children can have more of by learning to become more healthily self-disclosing. Similarly, in respect of over-regulation, we are doing a number of things to try and help the proportion of our students who are over-regulating. And for example, the wellbeing dog initiative, and also for our younger pupils, a reading dog, which is a new thing for me this year. It doesn't have to be a dog, a reading pet. This is not a hyper intelligent border collie who can read bedtime stories to your young children. This is a less judgmental audience for over-regulators to practice reading aloud to. And if you know what I mean by the give me a bonio gaze that a dog can give you, for a sort of a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old who's reading aloud, that imploring, entreating, devoted look from a pet might appear to signify huge levels of approval, unconscious of the slips, the pauses, the hesitations, the mispronunciations that a parent, or worse still, a teacher might confer. But actually, one of the other things that I've been particularly thinking about in this respect is, because we're reaching that stage of the year of choosing the pupils to whom we give particular authority, is to look at our students on whom we are about to confer this responsibility and asking ourselves the questions, are these students hugely over-regulating already? And if we give them a lapel badge or a particular tie or a particular responsibility in the school, will we be ratcheting up the pressure still further on this child to over-regulate even more to please an even more diverse and demanding audience? And if that is correlated with a low level of self-disclosure, could we be building in the kind of volcanic eruption in a final year, whether that's in year 6, 8, 11 or 13, depending on the nature of the school, that would be really deeply unhelpful for a child. So in respect of over-regulation, looking for ways in which to help those who have never experimented with being in anything but the middle lane of the motorway, to understand how to get back into that lane if they should get into the inside or outside lane at any stage. And then miscellaneously, we are also looking at the way in which Aaas tracking data can inform PSHE, the way it can inform the kind of questions we ask in our wellbeing survey. We have an annual wellbeing survey which produces an enormous amount of data. And also prompting discussion of what we can do better in terms of the role of the tutor. Very simple thing. If our tutors were to get 15% better at one-to-one tutoring their tutees, whatever that 15% means, and no, I'm not sure that I currently know how we might measure that, but if they were to get 15% better at being tutors to their tutor groups, what might we see in terms of the disclosure scores of our students as they come into school and they relate school as a safe place to disclose who they are compared to home? And then, as I've mentioned, in senior prefects, making sure that the responsibility we give our students is constructive and helpful for them, and not actually just placing an additional hazard on their road. I'm going to stop there, Simon. Jim.
Well, what a stimulating morning we have had. So many thanks to Simon, Richard and John for all that you've given us to think about this morning. Among many other things, we have, of course, been considering cognitive priming. I very much enjoyed the Q&A about that and the distinction between unsubtle and subtle priming. I'm mindful of a conversation overheard. My daughter and some of her friends, they all go to very fine London independent schools, one of them was heard to say, "If I hear about grit and resilience one more time, I'll have a breakdown, and that'll show them." There was so perhaps the unsubtle variety there, but so much that's been memorable about the input, and thank you, John, particularly for those thoughts on mimicry, whether you're a waiter in a restaurant or interrogating someone for FBI purposes, then paying attention and repeating back may come in handy. But as a serious point, something that we see in our schools, I'm sure. The thought of sitting in a comfortable chair, clutching a warm coffee cup, will stick in the mind as well, something that's common to our daily experience. The silent errands to the library. The effect of names, perhaps we started off with Simon Walker. That'll explain the pedestrian beginning to the day. But things will look up this afternoon when Professor Luckin appears in the panel. But the final thoughts. I mean, one thing that really strikes me as someone who's been in education for quite a while, of course, is that the effect that we have on our pupils takes many forms. And my belief is that every experience that the boys and girls have in our schools, from the moment they arrive, from the expressions on our faces, from the physical environment that they're in, through to the classroom and the quality of human relationships. And we all bear this awesome responsibility to make sure that complete experience is educationally good and wholesome and producing the right sort of effect on our young people. So there's so much to take away from this morning. Thank you. And my job now is to send you on your way to lunch.